You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 4th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Is Mexico's new president really going to be all that different? Could Europe's far-right parties suspend their dislike of each other to form a power bloc in the new European Parliament? And when and how should we start teaching children that things on the internet are very frequently wrong? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Lisette, Reymer and Andrew Thompson will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the artist George Butler about his resolutely old-school approach to conflict coverage. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Andrew Thompson, Latin American specialist and Latin news contributor, and by Lisette Reymer, Europe correspondent for News Hub NZ. Andrew, as the only non-Antipodean at the table today, we will allow you to go first. Welcome to the show. You have, as I understand it, been sailing up and down a bit recently.
Yes, I live down on the south coast, and I have a small boat, can take 3 or 4 people, called a Drascombe lugger. And it's summer, although it might not be apparent.
It's speaking on behalf of the Antipodean contingent at this table, Andrew, if this is your idea of a summer, honestly.
But it does mean that within the British perception of temperature and sun, I'm doing quite a bit of sailing for the next few months, which is good fun.
It does sound not necessarily all that pertinent to much of what we're talking about, though if you want to shoehorn in any seagoing metaphors to any, like we could talk about Mexico's new president facing choppy waters. That
rough waters,
exactly. That kind of thing. Just stew on that for a second.
Politicians under the weather.
Exactly. All of oh God, no, there's thousands of them. What have I started? Lisette, huge commemorations due shortly on the Normandy beaches to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and quite rightly so. But you've recently been attending the commemoration of another World War II epic.
Yeah, I was very fortunate enough to go to Casino and commemorate also the 80th anniversary of that, which New Zealanders were very involved with. Often, and for good reason, Gallipoli that people talk about when they talk about the New Zealand and the Australia effort, but actually the Kiwis were very involved, particularly our Māori battalion and what happened in Casino. So really special to be able to commemorate that. It's always incredibly touching to be at those services, and I think there's something about the 80th milestone that's particularly powerful, because I think a lot of people are looking around and wondering how many veterans there are going to be left to show up at future major commemorations.
This is, I think, is what has lent them poignancy this year. Realistically, this is the last big one at which there will be any survivors.
Yeah, and I think when you can see veterans looking at the gravestones of their friends, that hits you on a really different level.
Well, we will have more from you both very shortly, but first, border security is among the top issues for American voters in this year's election, not least because Republicans and their cheerleaders in the conservative media will not cease going on about it, feverishly accusing the Biden administration of allowing unchecked immigration along the United States southern border with Mexico. None of which is to say that this isn't a thing. The US Border Patrol reckons a record-breaking 2.4 million people entered the country unlawfully during the past fiscal year. For perspective, that's an entire Houston. Earlier this year, Republicans voted against a bipartisan border security bill in the Senate, claiming they thought the measure didn't go far enough. Without congressional action, President Joe Biden today is set to sign an executive order that will curb the number of asylum seekers at the border. And for more on this, I'm joined now by the journalist H.J. Mai in Washington, D.C. H.J., first of all, what exactly is this executive order going to do?
Yeah, hey, Andrew. Well, this order will really, just shut down the border, to be honest. After a certain threshold has been reached, that threshold, according to administration officials, has been set at 2,500 unlawful border crossings per day. So what that really means is, once that number has been reached, no asylum seekers, nobody else will be, admitted. They will just be removed. and those who try to enter the country illegally will be barred, from re-entering the country for at least 5 years. It's actually something you mentioned that there was a bipartisan border deal struck in the Senate that was then later, struck down by Republicans, and that actually the same, threshold and the same action was in that border bill. And this would be in effect as long as the numbers are high, which would be the case right now if it would go into effect immediately. The current numbers are about 3,500 daily border crossings or illegal crossings into the country. And it would only be lifted if the numbers would fall below 1,500 people for a 2-week period.
Do we understand what the logic of the threshold is and how or why 2,500 was arrived at? It still does seem like kind of a lot of people.
It certainly is. It certainly is. I bet if you ask some of the border communities who have been struggling in recent years, it's still a lot of people. I think the administration has not specifically said what the reason for that number is, but I think that's the number that they think by the way the system is currently set up with immigration court and the number of border patrol agents that they have, that they're comfortable with if the number, as I mentioned, is below 2,500. I think that's what the administration goes for, that they think they can handle 2,500, take them through the legal process of filing for asylum and dealing with that number. But the administration so far, at least, has not specifically mentioned why the number is set at 2,500.
President Biden's Republican detractors would not necessarily be wrong to say that he has had, most of his term of office to do something decisive about this and hasn't done it. Is it untowardly cynical to suspect that he's doing it now because he is still trailing Donald Trump in a lot of polls, and the key issue on which he is getting beaten up by Trump on is immigration?
Yeah, no, I don't think you're wrong at all. It's not cynical to think that. I think this is very much driven by politics and by this year's upcoming presidential election. Yes, President Trump, even after he was convicted or found guilty last week in New York, on Friday when he gave his press conference, he once again started with the issue of immigration before going into his legal troubles. So it's clearly something that is on the mind of a lot of Americans. And as you rightfully said, so the Biden administration, has had to deal with this for the past 3 years. The numbers have been steadily rising. There has been no congressional action, and people are frustrated. So, yeah, this is definitely something that the administration is doing because of the poll numbers, as you mentioned, and, looking at November. And it's something that they hope will satisfy at least, those few independent voters that are still out there and maybe, are willing to give Biden another 4 years.
H.J. Mai in Washington, D.C., thank you for joining us. President Biden will be speaking later, and we will, of course, be following that up on our shows tomorrow. But to bring back today's daily panel of Lisette, Reymer and Andrew Thompson, we will look now at Mexico, which was always going to elect a new president last weekend. Mexico always does. Its presidents are limited to a single 6-year term. Had the incumbent, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, better known as AMLO, been able to stand, he probably would have won. Instead, his preferred successor has, and by a considerable margin. Claudia Sheinbaum is obviously something different in a couple of respects. When she dons the presidential sash in October, she will become Mexico's first female and first Jewish president. Though it remains to be seen whether she'll govern differently, she will have the option. She seems on track to win a 2/3 supermajority in both houses of Congress. Andrew, first of all, she pitched herself, in fairness, and as well as being characterised as continuity AMLO. But nonetheless, she seems to have won 5 million more votes than he did when he was elected. And granted, there might be slightly more Mexicans than there were 6 years ago. But nonetheless, she has a mandate of her own, doesn't she?
She does have a mandate of her own. And if you like, although she's been a long-term political ally of AMLO, she has a significant track record of her own. She was mayor of or leader of Mexico City for 6 years. And Mexico City has a population of between 20 and 24 million people. So it's like running a small country. And she has, throughout the campaign, highlighted that homicide rates went down in Mexico City. and she will sort of rattle off a lot of her achievements. So she's still got a very difficult thing to do, which is to express a degree of continuity with the man who was her mentor and who's still in power for a few months yet, while at the same time saying some things will change under me and I have my own, political sort of history, if you like.
Lisette, it has obviously been much remarked upon, not least by President-elect Sheinbaum, that she will be Mexico's first female president. This is something which obviously shouldn't be a big whoop, a country electing a woman to lead it. But is it still a big whoop, especially in this context? Because before anybody writes in, I am aware of the differences between head of government and head of state, and I know bigger countries than Mexico, like Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, have had female prime ministers. I think I'm right in saying that after Brazil, Mexico becomes the biggest country to have elected a woman as its head of state.
Yeah, of course that's a big whoop. I think that's always going to be something to celebrate, the more countries that find themselves in that situation. What I also like about it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the alternative, the second place getter, was also a female. So they've
just gone crazy.
Yeah, they've gone crazy. But that puts you in a double exciting position from a female point of view. I also think it's important to acknowledge Mexico's situation broadly, and that there is a lot of gender-based violence there, a lot of femicides, and to have now a female elected into this position is significant. And whether or not it will make a massive difference to those violence rates, we wait and see. But you would hope that a female in that position would have that in mind with her policies, would have policies that are specifically targeting the success of women and gender equality and making sure that females have education and job opportunities that then improves their position in a household and in a community and society, and that over time we will see that having a female in a leadership position at that level is going to spread out into the general community, into the society and the way the country operates.
Well, we can only hope so. Andrew, as has been noted, she does have extraordinary leeway, probably, depending on how it finally shakes out. But she may have license to spend 6 years doing more or less whatever she likes. If she has a supermajority in both houses, as I understand it, she can basically sort of rewrite the Constitution without necessarily having to ask anybody. And from what we know of her, is that an opportunity she is likely to take up? Because her predecessor and mentor, sure as hell would have. He, for example, wanted to elect Supreme Court judges because he found the appointed ones kept telling him he couldn't do things. Does she seem like somebody who is going to act with restraint when there's no real need to?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think the important point is that the existing president, AMLO, he hasn't given up on his reform proposals. And there is a small window, which is basically the month of September. The new Congress takes office on the 1st of September, and the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, takes office on 30 days later. So in that narrow window, you have a potential two-thirds majority in Congress and an outgoing radical president who wants to change lots of things. And the reforms which AMLO has proposed and which Sheinbaum says she will follow include electing Supreme Court judges by popular election, which opens the whole issue of politicization, and giving to certain public sector employees 100% final salary pensions. So it's a big group of things, along with closing down the autonomous electoral authority and closing down a number of quangos that López Obrador doesn't particularly like. So the markets are looking to see what Claudia Sheinbaum, how she will follow these policies, whether she'll make some changes. And the fact that they are close to a two-thirds majority still depends on votes yet to be counted. But the fact that they're close led to a 6% drop in shares on the Mexico Stock Exchange and to something like a 4 or 5% depreciation of the peso. So from a business point of view, there is worry that she could be head of quite a radical, less free market-friendly government. On the other hand, she's, if you like, not as much of a populist as López Obrador is. She's an academic, a physicist. She's a bit more balanced in her opinions. And some people think that, or hope, that she will be a little bit more moderate, and reassure people worried about democratic backsliding in the country.
Just finally on this, Lisette, one aspect of AMLO's populist grandstanding that it's not clear whether or not she seeks to emulate was his incredible habit, really, although amazingly people used to watch it pretty much every day, starting with a live press conference every day at 7 a.m, which would often bang on for north of 2 hours, while he sort of inveighed against enemies, real and imagined, sort of launched upon, extemporized disquisitions on aspects of Mexican history. I don't know what else is on Mexican breakfast television. I'm assuming not much, because he did actually used to do quite reasonable numbers. My general question is, would you be excited to tune in every morning for a solid 2 hours of the leader of your country?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I can't think of anything worse. Every day, absolutely not.
2 hours, ideal. In an ideal world, 2 hours is more than I would want to hear from my country's leader in their entire term of office.
I have to add very briefly that those 2 hours included the president singing songs that he particularly liked.
Now that I would
which
watch.
proved a political point.
I'll be looking that up later.
Yeah. OK, now you're talking. But we will pivot now from somewhere which has voted to somewhere which is about to. That slender majority on past form of EU citizens who can be bothered will begin electing a new European Parliament later this week. It is widely anticipated that this will go well for far-right populist parties across Europe, who are expecting to profit at the polls from beating up on 1, immigrants, and 2, the institution to which they aspire to be elected. This joyful prospect has inflamed further trepidation about the possibility of a new far-right supergroup, arguably the first since Cream. One for the Eric Clapton heads there. Lisette, can we at least reassure ourselves that what is going to stop any such alliance from really coming properly together is that they all hate each other even more than they hate foreigners?
Yeah, I think there is an element of that, to be fair, because even within those far-right groups, there are people and individuals with very different feelings on things. And they've taken very deliberately different tacks. And especially, let's just take an obvious one, Ukraine and the continuation of supply of weapons and support for Ukraine. You can have the likes of Giorgia Meloni, who is pretty supportive now of the continuation of support for Ukraine and has been very vocal about that. And then Marine Le Pen is being very muddy on her position on it and is somewhat more, okay, we condemn the invasion of a free country, but we need to focus on peace and maybe we need to actually just work out a solution, whatever that looks like. And that's just one example of what those parties can be disagreeing on. And at the moment, that, for example, is a big one. That's not insignificant at this time in the world.
Because we did see, Andrew, a mildly amusing falling out between Marine Le Pen's National Rally and what people thought was their German analogue Alternative for Deutschland, except the AfD's leader picked, well, actually, I'm not sure there is a good moment, but certainly an election campaign is not an ideal time to equivocate about the legacy of the SS. And that proved to be too much even for the National Rally, at which point you would think a fellow would take a long, hard look in the mirror.
It's a hard one to respond to briefly. I think you will have that. Part of the idea of the far right, I presume, is to challenge the status quo and to come up with, if you like, outrageous ideas. And if you have a continent of 27 countries, each with their own far right, a lot of those ideas will be diverse and will clash and will point in different directions. Whether this will overall weaken the far right remains to be seen. And from my point of view, there is this, this is simplifying things terribly, but you have a traditional right-wing conservative linked to the establishment, and you have a far right. And they are moving in various places and in various ways into coalition with each other. Each one, I presume, planning how to make it work for them at the expense of the other one. So, there's a long history in this. If we look history and the present, if we look at the UK elections, the sudden reappearance of Nigel Farage, is, if you like, threatening the traditional Conservative Party, which seems to want to follow him on migration. And you get similar situations in other countries.
There is a question that is going to be posed to, I guess, what we might think of, Lisette, as more orthodox centre-right parties. And we've seen this posed by recent national elections in the Netherlands, and I think we're about to see it in Belgium. It's that question of, OK, these people got elected, but should we do business with them? And this is being asked in the context of Europe in particular about Giorgia Meloni's party, the Brothers of Italy. And on the one hand, you can see how and why people would think them beyond the pale, especially given their history as an, outright unapologetic Mussolini-esque fascist party. But the fact is that they are the main party of government of a serious European country. And is it realistic to say, well, we're not dealing with them?
I don't think so. And I think to a degree, actually, we've also seen Meloni soften slightly to conform a little bit with her position in the EU and these other big countries that she now has to play ball with to a degree. And we haven't maybe seen that yet from the likes of Le Pen. But I think this isn't even just a Europe situation. Globally, even in little old New Zealand, we have seen this rise of the far right and this just general dissatisfaction with the institution and with politicians, and people want change. They want to be heard, not just listened to. They want real action. And I think that is why people are leaning towards the extreme, and the extreme is becoming more and more mainstream. So people are it's all just becoming a little bit more palatable, some of their policies and some of those ideas that a while ago might have seemed really, really extreme. I think even if you look at the last European elections, the protests that were dominating the conversation were about climate change, and it was the fight for all the children on the streets protesting. These days, it's the farmers who are out protesting, saying that the climate and all the policy around that is punitive or it's too extreme, and they want to reel it right back. And I think that is why people are looking towards those far-right parties as, I'm going to hook my bandwagon to you. And the centre can't ignore that anymore because it is a growing public tidal wave of change.
Well, on an arguably not unrelated front, listeners who have relatives of pensionable age on Facebook may well believe that it is not young people who are in the most urgent need of media literacy classes. Spain, for one country, though it appears to have given up hope on the generation of superannuated seethers angrily trading JPEGs of inaccurate or invented George Orwell quotes, is hoping to rescue primary schoolers and onwards. A new media literacy curriculum to be taught in schools will include lessons in spotting hoaxes and fake news and avoiding the dangers posed by social networks, which include radicalisation, polarisation and being bored to death by angry morons. Andrew, should there be more of this kind of thing? Should we be getting in front of kids at a much earlier stage and saying pretty much everything on the internet is nonsense, please don't believe any of it?
My answer is yes. I think what's interesting is, a lot of interesting things that the Spanish government is clearly trying to come up with a balanced approach. But as part of their discussions, there's been research done, which shows that I think it's 94% of adolescents own a mobile phone. 90% connect to the internet at least once a day. On weekends, they're on their mobiles about 5 hours a day. And I think that adds up to a reasonable cause for concern. What the proposed legislation the government is trying to get in would recognise teenagers' rights in terms of equal access to the internet and freedom of expression, but put in place a series of protection. For example, and this has been discussed in various places, various countries, some sort of reliable age verification process, which could be allowed to block access to porn sites, to other harmful, to particularly notorious sites.
Yeah, I mean, that statistic that you mentioned there, Andrew, kind of boggled my mind. This idea, Lisette, that people are spending 5 hours a day on weekends on their mobile phones. Thinking back to when I was approximately the age they're concerned about, certainly nobody had heard of a mobile phone. I lived in Canberra, which had 2 TV channels. I'm not sure what I did for 5 hours a day on weekends. Mostly, I suspect, whining to my mum that I was bored.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've had the same thought process, except, and don't mean any offence, but slightly later on, and we already had a phone, but the phone couldn't connect to the internet, and when it did, you would push the button drastically, being like, "Don't waste all my money, don't waste all my money," and you'd go back to your snake game, and we used to just play that game of racing a little snake around the screen for hours on end on the Nokia phone, and that was about as dangerous as it got. And even then, my mum was yelling at me to get off it, and I think now I'm not a parent, but I've got nieces and nephews, and it scares me so much what they're accessing on their phones and how much time they will inevitably spend on their phones, because even I'm a sucker for my phone and for spending way too much time on it. And I think this idea of educating people as part of just basic education all throughout primary school, high school, about what is good phone practice, but also what is safe, what is real, is so important, because even I know adults who need a lesson in that, who need to go and learn how to truly ascertain what is real online and what is not, fake news type education. So I think there's no getting rid of technology. We have to learn to live with it now, and I think we do. Yeah. I think we do. So I think education at a young age has got to be part of the solution.
But it's easy to see, though, Andrew, how the education itself is going to become a culture war frontline, isn't it? Because people are going to get upset about which news sites get called out as being fake ones that people shouldn't pay attention to. I mean, you can really easily see how this is going to go.
I think there's also a sense in which what they're proposing in Spain is that phones would come, if you like, preloaded with blocks on certain kinds of sites, but it would be up to parents.
Kids will get around these.
Yeah, and what they're saying is it would be up to parents to say whether they're happy with that particular set of blocks on websites, or want something completely different, or want nothing at all. So there are a lot of concerns, culture war and otherwise, to do with how children use the internet. The other thing that the research found, which I'm not sure if I mentioned, was that on average kids in Spain, and presumably it's similar in the rest of Europe, get a mobile phone at the age of 11, and it's given to them by their parents.
Which again is extraordinary. It does. I think about this a lot, Lisette. I think I am of the last generation of human beings who will ever have reached adulthood without having to deal with all this, and without people knowing where they were at all times, and for whom being out of touch was just actually normal. But I did just finally, and in an attempt to be constructive, want to go back to what you were saying about your younger relatives. And as a proper journalist yourself, do you ever tell them how not to get caught out and what they should and shouldn't be looking for? And if you do, what do you tell them?
Well, they're too young at the moment. The oldest is 6, so doesn't have a phone, and it will be very interesting to see.
And won't till next year.
Yeah, it's probably due this birthday, so stand by and I'll have a better update for you. But yeah, I definitely think in the years to come, it's not really my place because their parents will do it, I'm sure, and I don't want to interfere, but I'm sure I will agony aunt them and give them some pointers, especially because, then maybe they can pass that on to their friends.
Who won't listen.
Yeah.
Lisette Reymer and Andrew Thompson, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, we hear from a practitioner of the nearly forgotten art of reportage illustration. George Butler has spent the last 18 years carting ink and paper to zones of conflict and crisis, using drawing to slow down his reporting of people's struggles to gain a perspective that he believes is missing amid the frantic churn of the standard news cycle. Having reported from datelines including Afghanistan, Nepal and of Gaza, his new book, Ukraine, Remember Also Me, is released on June the 6th and features illustrations of and testimonies of the people Butler met on his trips to Ukraine in 2022 and 2023 following Russia's invasion. Monocle's Gunnar Gronlid headed to Butler's exhibition of his new work at Gallery Different in London to hear about the work and began by asking him how he started out in something as niche as reportage illustration and how he ended up covering wars and conflicts.
Yeah, it sounds like a thing of the past, doesn't it? I did illustration at university at Kingston, and I really just pen and ink drawing from life on location was where I felt most comfortable, and I spent a lot of time in markets in London and talking to people, and all the people I admired, like people like Ronald Searle, some of the Second World War artists, had drawn for newspapers in courtrooms or in the war in Bosnia, or Linda Kitson in the Falklands. And I suppose as a young man I just thought that was exciting and I'd like to do it, and I had this obsession about drawing from life and making it accurate and inky, and that's what I set out to do about 15 years ago. But of course, as I sort of learned my trade, and particularly in Ukraine most recently, where I was commissioned to go for a couple of magazines in Germany and America, I realised that the story that the person's telling over your shoulder whilst you're drawing is in fact almost possibly more important and certainly more poignant and valuable as the drawing itself.
And can you explain a little bit about your style, how you express all of those things that are being told to you over the shoulder? I mean, just walking through the gallery now, I see little things like newspaper clippings and jottings of notes on the drawings, almost like what a journalist would do in their notebook, but It's right there on the piece of art. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I make pen and ink drawings on an A2 board, so often standing up from life. So there's this quite immediate fluency to the drawing, to the line, and I'm usually drawing for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour. If someone's, depending on how patient people are when I'm interviewing them, depending on the situation. And then I'm picking out areas of colour that I think are interesting. There's sometimes very detailed patches and then big spaces of white, which I think these are composite images, but I think they leave sort of space for the viewer's imagination. And I think that's important at the moment. We might talk about it more in a minute, but we receive huge amounts of information, quite often passively, through photographs and film, and these are an alternative moment to sort of sit quietly with something that you might know a little bit about. It's not being forced upon you. It is in theory supposed to be a beautiful image, even if it is of an abhorrent scene, and that I think allows people to sort of be unthreatened and to approach a subject slightly differently.
Yeah, can you expand a little bit upon that? Because, for example, you mentioned at the beginning of the exhibition that the Ukraine war, naturally, because now we all have smartphones in our pockets and we can take these highly detailed images live and they are bombarding our social media feeds, and so we're seeing all this come through, and yet I think for a lot of us still there is a kind of disconnect from the actual human element of what is happening on the ground, which you'd think it'd be the opposite with social media, but actually there is a disconnect. So for you, what is the sort of value of taking a step back and actually cutting out a lot of the detail of what is literally there in the scene, and representing what is it that you're looking for? What are the details that you get sort of hooked on?
I think it's true humanity in a very raw way. So there's sort of the love and the resolve and the family and the community that I have found when sitting in those places and drawing. Is just, it doesn't matter what you're drawing or if it's any good. The process of doing it over an hour or 2 hours is often enough just to open that door to some of the people above, like Vladimir and Madame Olga. And I think that the way we receive our news, the way that it's captured and the way that it's delivered, quite often overlook some of those stories. It's not sensational enough, it's not exciting enough, you don't click, you don't like, or you don't buy the newspaper. So I think we're missing out, and I think we're supposed to be more interconnected than ever, but in fact we're running the risk of having a much shallower understanding of people in Ukraine or in Donetsk or in Gaza City at the moment, even though we know that it's coming through like thick and fast. We've only got to pick up our mobiles. So these drawings are my antidote to that. It's analog, it's old-fashioned, but I think it's really important. I had a man yesterday, Vladimir, upstairs, who I've drawn, And I drew him lying on his bed. He's a soldier. His daughter was living in Poland. And he texted me yesterday saying, I saw the book on Instagram. Can I buy 5 copies? I've got a gift for you. You have to come back. And I said, and I'll obviously give you some copies of the book. And I said, how are you? And he's like, oh, I'm fine. I've got PTSD, but life's carrying on. We've got no choice. And that connection would just not have happened had I not spent an hour with him drawing.
And this might be a difficult question for you to answer, but what do you think the normal journalists who just write or take images, the proper journalists, that's one way of putting it, but what can they learn from this method of doing things? Have you gained any insights that you think are transferable beyond your style of reportage?
It's really difficult because obviously all the journalists I know, and I travel with a lot of them, and when they're writing and taking photographs, we all say the same thing, that the best stories are when you spend time and when you can interact and when you get that texture, a bit more depth, and but the word counts and the space in newspapers and the time and the deadlines mean that they can't always do their best work. Or they're working to a different brief, or they're working to a new newspaper or a new editor that perhaps they aren't aligned with. So there's a real restriction there. I guess the only thing I'm saying is that there's this great language of drawing, which was such a proven formula in the 1840s to the 1950s and onwards, that transcends the barriers of normal language, and that has been overlooked. But it works and it's valuable. And it's unthreatening and it doesn't polarize. And I think that's an element of the news that we should perhaps concentrate on at the moment.
George Butler speaking to Gunnar Grönlid. George's new book, Ukraine, Remember Also Me, is out on June 6th. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Lisette, Reymer and Andrew Thompson, also to H.J. Mai. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and researched by Gunnar Grönlid. Our sound engineer was Tamsin Howard. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.